Hello there. Tonight we are going to drift back to the glittering, dangerous heart of the Byzantine Empire, where a woman once stepped off the stage out of scandal and straight into one of the most powerful thrones in the world. Imagine you're in Constantinople around the year 500 CE. Candles flicker, the marble is polished, the city hums with rumors. Somewhere in the shadows of the Hippodrome, a girl named Theodora is charming crowds and making enemies. You probably won't survive in this world if you're poor female and a performer, especially not with opinions. And yet somehow, Theodora did. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. Post your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing where you're all tuning in from. Now turn off the lights, maybe turn on the fan for some soothing noise, and let's get started tonight. Theodora's life story begins not in a palace, but behind the curtains of a performance hall. Her father worked as a bear trainer at the Hippodrome, a bustling arena where politics and entertainment blurred until one could easily maul the other. When he died, Theodora's mother reportedly paraded her daughters through the crowd, begging performers to vote her husband's successor into the guild. It didn't work. Life was merciless. Theodora became a stage performer, which back then wasn't the classy theater kid energy we think of now. It meant jokes, dancing, a sharp tongue, and quite often a second life as a courtesan. Roman elites would have called her unsuitable with a curled lip and a smug toga flick. Theodora famously did not care. Now here's where things get weird. After traveling with a troupe across North Africa, Theodora abandoned the stage and wandered to the desert of Egypt. Some say she lived in a Christian commune. Others believe she had a spiritual awakening. Historians still debate whether this was repentance or reinvention, but either way, when she returned to Constantinople, she wasn't just a performer. She was a woman with a plan. Cue Justinian. At the time, he was a high-ranking official destined to become emperor. He saw Theodora, heard her speak, and promptly ignored every voice telling him she was trouble. He changed Roman law so he could marry her, yes. He literally changed the law for love, and by 525 CE, she became empress. Now, being empress wasn't just about pearls and parades. It meant court intrigue, whispered betrayals, and being seen constantly. But Theodora didn't hide in silk. She stood next to Justinian at council meetings. She advised on diplomacy. She helped write laws. She also brought her past with her, including empathy for women, like the one she had once been. She fought for women's rights in ways that sounded suspiciously modern. She got laws passed protecting women from forced prostitution. She secured property rights for wives and mothers. She even established the Metanoia, a home for former sex workers trying to start over. It had running water and mosaics and was frankly better than most early hotels. But her most legendary moment came in 532 CE during the Nika riots, a violent uprising so intense that Justinian considered fleeing the city. Imagine thousands of people screaming in the streets, setting fire to buildings, blaming the emperor for corruption and excess. The palace gates were shaking. Senators were whispering escape routes. Justinian panicked. And Theodora, she crossed her arms and said, "Purple makes a fine burial shroud." Translation, "If I die, I'll die as an empress." That one line stopped an empire from collapsing. Justinian stayed. The imperial guard cracked down, and Theodora walked out of the smoke with her crown still on. Here's the odd part. While her political strength was undeniable, ancient sources, especially Procopius, were obsessed with trashing her reputation. In one book, he called her a savior. In another, a harlot with witchy tendencies. Historians still debate whether these contrasting portraits were evidence of her complexity or just a man who couldn't handle a powerful woman. She died in 548 CE, possibly from cancer, leaving Justinian devastated. He never remarried. Statues of Theodora still stand, her face calm, her eyes unreadable. In them you see a woman who survived the unspeakable and reshaped her empire. And if you're still awake, imagine her now walking the halls of Constantinople with measured steps, her robes whispering secrets across marble floors, holding the empire together in the folds of her sleeves. Now let's slip away from the thrones of Byzantium and follow the scent of sea salt to the wild northern coasts of England, where another powerful woman lived not in palaces, but in a windswept abbey on a cliff. The sea crashes against the cliffs of Northumbria. The wind never quite stops howling here, and the smell of salt and wet grass clings to your cloak. It's the 7th century now, and just inland from the rocky shoreline stands the double monastery of Whitby, built from timber and prayer, and led by a woman who could silence kings with a glance, Hilda of Whitby. She's no queen, but her power runs deep and quiet like the tide. Hilda, born around 614 AD, was of royal blood herself, the grand niece of King Edwin of Northumbria. That means she could have married into any number of convenient alliances worn velvet, and spent her life pretending embroidery was fun. Instead, she took a sharp left turn into holiness. Hilda became a nun in her early 30s, leaving behind the polite expectations of royal womanhood. She studied under Bishop Aidan of Lindisfarne, basically the cool spiritual mentor of the time, and impressed him so much that he placed her in charge of a monastery before she'd even finished her training. Some people just give off main character energy. Eventually, she founded Whitby Abbey in 657 AD. It wasn't your average sleepy religious compound. This place was bold a double monastery, meaning it housed both men and women, separately of course, but still scandalously close for the time. Hilda ran the whole show, overseeing daily life, education, spiritual development, and probably breaking up the occasional squabble over who got the best blanket near the fire. She turned Whitby into a beacon of learning, drawing in nobles, monks, and anyone who wanted to escape the chaos of tribal wars and find something that smelled vaguely of peace. She trained bishops, mentored kings, and encouraged scholarship with the kind of gentle intensity that made you want to reread your Latin until your candle burned out. But let's pause here for a curious detail, because in the middle of this elegant world of faith and intellect, there was a cowherd named Caedmon. Now Caedmon couldn't read. He couldn't write. He avoided social gatherings like the plague because he was embarrassed about not being able to sing the religious songs everyone else knew. One night, while everyone else was feasting and singing, Caedmon snuck off to the stables to hide in the hay. According to legend, he fell asleep and was visited in a dream by a heavenly being who asked him to sing about the creation of the world. He woke up with lyrics in his head. The next day, he nervously told the tale to Hilda. She didn't laugh. She didn't dismiss him. She said, "Interesting, join the monastery." And so he did. Under her guidance, Caedmon became the first recorded English language poet. Not Latin, not Greek, not something lofty and borrowed. His hymns were written in the common tongue, meant for the ears of common people. Historians still debate whether Caedmon was a real person or a legendary stand-in for oral poetry, but no one doubts that Hilda's response to him helped usher in a new kind of literary tradition, one rooted in vernacular beauty and spiritual simplicity. This abbess, with her sea-swept monastery and her cow poet apprentice, quietly helped shape the roots of English literature. And Hilda didn't stop there. In 664 AD, she hosted one of the most pivotal events in early English Christianity, the Synod of Whitby. The question at hand was hilariously specific: how to calculate the date of Easter. Should they follow the Roman calendar or the Celtic one? But behind this oddly mathematical debate lay a larger issue: who would lead the English Church, Rome or Ireland? Power unity and authority hung in the balance. Hilda's abbey, with its peaceful views and serious scroll collection, became the neutral ground. Clerics and kings gathered beneath the timbered roof. There were speeches, debates, and almost certainly passive-aggressive comments about each other's tonsures. In the end, the Roman method won out, but what mattered most was that Hilda had created a space where such a monumental compromise could even be possible. Odd fact of the night: according to legend, Hilda's abbey was plagued by so many seabirds that locals claimed she turned a plague of snakes into stone just to keep the place clean. The result: fossil ammonites from the nearby cliffs were nicknamed Hilda's Snakes, which honestly sounds like a solid name for a punk band. Hilda ruled Whitby for over 3 decades. She battled illness for the last 6 years of her life, but refused to step down. She was known for her wisdom and patience. Kings sought her counsel, and soldiers asked her blessing before battle. She died in 680 AD, but her legacy lingered like the salty air outside her abbey windows. By the time she passed, Whitby was more than a monastery, it was a lighthouse. Not just for piety, but for women's leadership, intellectual exchange, and the radical idea that a woman, even in a robe and sandals, could command empires through stillness. When we think of medieval power, we picture knights and swords. But Hilda of Whitby reminds us that some of the most enduring power comes from those who build, teach, and listen. She never raised a sword, but she shaped the world with her mind, and her monastery's influence would ripple across Britain for centuries. Now, if you're still awake, you can almost hear the waves again rolling in steady rhythm beneath the cliffs of Whitby, while candlelight flickers behind stone walls, and a woman in simple robes quietly changes the course of history, one hymn, one student, one soft-spoken decision at a time. And from here we shift south to sun-drenched courts and shadowy corridors of power, where a young woman named Eleanor of Aquitaine is about to rewrite what it means to be a medieval queen. There's something about Eleanor of Aquitaine that still makes historians sweat. Was she a hero, a rebel, a royal pain in the crown? Maybe all of the above. But what we know for sure is this. She lived nearly a century, outlasted 2 kings, gave birth to 3 others, survived a crusade, ran half of Europe, and got herself imprisoned for rebellion, then lived long enough to retire, forgive everybody, and do it all over again. Not bad for someone born in 1122 in the sunny, wine-drenched Duchy of Aquitaine. If you're picturing Eleanor as some fragile lady sitting around needle-pointing while her kingdom burns, adjust that. She was one of the richest heiresses in Europe, descended from a long line of troublemakers and troubadours. Her court in Aquitaine was famous for poetry, music, and flirtation, not exactly the grim monastic vibes of the north. By the time she was 15, she was duchess in her own right, with more land than most kings. That of course made her marriage bait. Within months of her father's death, she was married off to Louis VII of France. He was pious, awkward, and honestly more into church building than ruling. She was lively, strategic, and liked parties, poetry, and hawking. It was not a match made in heaven. But things got weirder. In 1147, Eleanor insisted on joining Louis on the Second Crusade. Not as an accessory, oh no. She raised her own troops and brought a whole entourage of noble women dressed like Amazons. Yes, seriously. Armor banners, the whole dramatic flair. Contemporary chroniclers were scandalized. Women were supposed to stay home and pray, not gallop off to the Holy Land with opinions and swords. The crusade itself, a mess. The French army was disorganized, the locals unwelcoming, and rumors began flying that Eleanor had grown a little too close to her uncle Raymond of Antioch. Historians still debate whether this was an actual affair or just 12th century tabloid energy, but either way, Louis was furious. By the time they limped back to France, their marriage was basically over. In 1152, the church granted them an annulment on the grounds of consanguinity, meaning they were too closely related by blood. Convenient. Eleanor packed up her court and her lands, and within 8 weeks, she married Henry Plantagenet, the young Duke of Normandy. If that name rings a bell, it's because 2 years later he became King Henry II of England. Now Eleanor was queen again, this time not just of England, but of a sprawling empire that stretched from the Scottish borders to the Pyrenees. And for a while it worked. They had 8 children, including the infamous Richard the Lionheart and King John. Yes, that King John, the Magna Carta one. Eleanor helped govern while Henry was off being Henry, storming castles, quarreling with bishops, and fathering illegitimate children like it was a competitive sport. But cracks began to show. Henry was brilliant, no doubt, but also a control freak with anger management issues. Eleanor, meanwhile, was used to running her own duchy, making her own alliances, and generally not being told to sit quietly. They clashed over politics, over sons, over Henry's many, many mistresses. By 1123, things came to a head. Eleanor sided with her sons, especially the eldest Henry the Young King, in a rebellion against their father. She encouraged them to rise up, promising them more power, more independence, more something. Whether she planned a full coup or just wanted better conditions for her boys is still debated. Either way, the revolt failed. Henry was not amused. He had Eleanor arrested and kept her under house arrest for 16 years. 16. During that time, she wasn't entirely out of the game. She moved between castles under guard-read letters from abroad and kept tabs on her children as they stabbed each other metaphorically and sometimes literally for scraps of power. Odd fact, during this time, Eleanor's reputation actually grew. Troubadours wrote songs about her. Clerics whispered her name. She became a legend before she even got out of jail. Then Henry died in 1189. Their son Richard took the throne and immediately freed his mother. Eleanor, now in her late 60s, got straight back to work. She served as regent while Richard went off on the Third Crusade. She negotiated with enemies, managed domestic affairs, and raised ransom money when Richard was captured on his way back. She even traveled to Castile in her 80s to arrange a diplomatic marriage for one of her granddaughters. Historians still debate just how much formal power she wielded in these later years versus how much she influenced those in power. But whether she was signing documents or whispering into the right ears, Eleanor was at the center of things. And here's the kicker: she died in 1204 at the age of 82. That's nearly a century of scheming, surviving, building, and rebuilding. By the end of her life, Eleanor had been the queen of 2 countries, the mother of 2 kings, and the matriarch of a dynasty that would rule Europe for generations. She left behind not just a bloodline, but a cultural legacy. Her court popularized the ideals of courtly love, the poetic, often scandalous, highly performative kind of romance that still echoes in everything from Shakespeare to Netflix. She helped fund the arts, encouraged literacy, and supported the flowering of a new kind of noblewoman, educated, eloquent, and very much not quiet. She was both admired and feared. The chroniclers couldn't agree on whether she was a saint or a schemer, but no one ever called her boring. Oddly enough, her tomb is still visited today. It's in Fontevraud Abbey in France, where she lies next to Henry and Richard. Her effigy shows her holding a book, a woman still reading, still learning, even in death. It's rare. Most royal effigies show folded hands or blank faces. Eleanor holds knowledge, and maybe that's what she always held most fiercely. Power came and went. Husbands ruled and raged. Sons rebelled. But Eleanor knew things. She read people. She read situations. She read rooms full of enemies and came out the other side with her crown intact. So if you're still listening, as your eyes begin to close, picture her not in court or on horseback, but sitting by a quiet fire, the smell of parchment and candle wax thick in the air, her fingers tracing lines in a manuscript she's already memorized. Around her, the political tides crash like waves, but she just turns the page. Now, as we leave Eleanor to her books and thrones, the world darkens a little. A crown lies empty in England, a storm brews. And somewhere across the channel, a woman named Matilda sharpens her mind for war, not with swordplay, but with absolute conviction. The wind over the English Channel is cold and bitter in the winter of 1135, and it's about to carry war across the land, long, brutal, exhausting war. At the center of it all, a woman in her 30s named Matilda. She isn't just anyone. She's the daughter of a king, the widow of an emperor, and the only legitimate heir to the throne of England. But this is medieval Europe, and Matilda's greatest crime isn't ambition or treason. It's being a woman who won't give up. Matilda, sometimes called Empress Matilda, was born in 1102, the daughter of King Henry I of England and Queen Matilda of Scotland. Her early life reads like a royal resume. At just 8 years old, she was sent to Germany to marry the Holy Roman Emperor Henry I. She became an empress before she could spell it. They ruled together for over a decade until his death in 1125. Matilda returned to England a widow, but not for long. Her father, King Henry, was reeling from tragedy. His only legitimate son, William, had drowned in the White Ship disaster, a boat so cursed it feels like something out of a Norse saga. Dozens of nobles died in one terrible night, and with them, the male line of succession. Henry needed a new plan, so he did something deeply controversial. He made the nobles of England and Normandy swear oaths of loyalty to Matilda as his successor, multiple times, in public, with lots of handshakes and dramatic vows. Everyone nodded and said yes. Of course, Your Majesty, will totally support your daughter if you die. You can guess what happened next. In 1135, Henry died. And within days, the throne was seized by Matilda's cousin Stephen of Blois. He sailed from Boulogne, charmed a few key lords, and convinced the Archbishop of Canterbury to crown him king. That fast, that easy, all those oaths forgotten like bad wedding vows. Matilda, who had been in Normandy, was furious. And not just because she'd been robbed. She knew what was at stake. This wasn't just about her claim, it was about the future of England. So she did what most people in her position wouldn't have dared. She prepared for war. The next 19 years would be known as the Anarchy. Sounds dramatic, it was. Castles burned, loyalties shifted. The roads were so unsafe that travelers begged for divine protection just to get between villages. Christ and his saints slept, wrote one chronicler describing the chaos. In the middle of this storm, Matilda held her ground, sometimes literally inside freezing stone keeps while the world outside crumbled. At first, things looked promising. She had support from her half-brother Robert of Gloucester, from King David of Scotland, and from her new husband Geoffrey of Anjou. Geoffrey was complicated. He was years younger, fiery, and not exactly beloved by the Anglo-Norman elite. But politically the match made sense. Together they had a son, young Henry, destined to become Henry II. Matilda's forces made steady progress. In 1141 they captured King Stephen at the Battle of Lincoln. It was a huge turning point. For the first time, Matilda had the throne within reach. She entered London in triumph. The nobles swore fealty again. Everything was lined up for her coronation. And then she blew it. See, Matilda wasn't exactly cuddly. She was proud, formal. She carried herself like the empress she had once been. But England wasn't used to women in power, especially not women who expected to be treated like kings. She refused to play humble. She didn't flatter the Londoners. She demanded funds. She alienated potential allies. And the people turned on her. Before she could be crowned, a mob rose up and forced her out of the city. Imagine one day you're draped in royal robes and the next you're galloping out the back gate while bakers and fishmongers scream for your blood. It was humiliating. It was dangerous. But Matilda kept going. That same year, in a wild reversal of fortune, her most loyal ally, Robert of Gloucester, was captured in battle. To save him, Matilda was forced to trade Stephen for Robert. The king was free again and the war dragged on. Matilda retreated to Oxford, where she spent the winter of 1142 in one of the coldest sieges of the entire conflict. Trapped in the snowbound city with enemy forces closing in, she faced starvation. And here comes the bit that sounds made up, but isn't. Matilda escaped in the dead of night, dressed in white to blend in with the snow, crossing the frozen Thames River in silence while her enemies slept. Historians still debate the logistics. Did she walk or ride? Was it snowing or just cold? But the image endures a royal fugitive gliding through moonlight, every breath a puff of steam, every step an act of defiance. After that, the war ground on, but the tide began to turn, not in battlefields, but in patience. Everyone was exhausted. Stephen ruled, but barely. Matilda held parts of the West, but with limited reach. Towns changed hands so often they probably stopped repainting the signs. Then something changed. Matilda's son, young Henry, now a teenager, began to step into the spotlight. Charismatic, fierce, and politically savvy, he started to earn the support that had eluded his mother. People looked at him and saw a future. They looked at Stephen and saw the past. In 1153, a truce was finally brokered. The Treaty of Wallingford ended the war with an elegant compromise. Stephen would remain king, but upon his death, Henry would inherit the throne. Matilda wasn't crowned. She never got her coronation. But she won the long game. In 1154, Stephen died, and Henry, her son, became King Henry II of England. The Plantagenet dynasty had begun. Odd fact, despite all the drama, Matilda and Stephen may have exchanged letters later in life, and Stephen even treated her courteously in his final years. It's the medieval version of frenemies. Matilda spent the rest of her life in Normandy managing lands and acting as a trusted advisor to Henry. She remained sharp, politically active, and according to letters still a little salty. She died in 1167 at the age of 65, buried at Bec Abbey, beneath a tomb that reads in Latin, "Great by birth, greater by marriage, greatest in her offspring." Which is true, but also a bit of a backhanded compliment. Historians still debate how to interpret Matilda's story. Was she too proud for her own good? Did she fail because she was ahead of her time, or because she refused to compromise? What's clear is that she refused to accept the idea that being a woman meant she couldn't rule. She demanded power, she fought for it, and in the end she passed it on to someone who would wield it for decades. So if your eyes are still open, think of her wrapped in white, walking across the frozen river, in silence, stubborn as ice, steady as stone. A woman who wouldn't back down even when the world told her to sit down. But now, from icy rivers and failed coronations, we head to a very different battlefield. One where a teenage girl claimed to hear the voices of saints, put on a suit of armor, and led an army that would change the fate of France. The chill morning mist hangs low over the village of Domremy, and somewhere among the bleating sheep and smoke from thatched rooftops, a teenage girl is hearing voices. Not the metaphorical kind, literal voices. She says they come from saints. Michael, Catherine, Margaret. They speak with urgency. They say she's been chosen not to marry, not to pray, but to save France. This girl is named Joan. Later she'll be known as La Pucelle d'Orléans, the Maid of Orleans. But right now she's just a 13-year-old peasant girl in braided hair and homespun clothes with no formal education, no noble blood, and absolutely no military training. She's also about to become the most improbable general in European history. Let's back up. It's the early 1400s and France is in pieces. The 100 Years' War with England has been dragging on for well about 100 years. English forces control huge swaths of northern France. The French king, Charles VI, has gone mad. His heir, the Dauphin, Charles, hasn't even been crowned. Paris is in English hands. Morale is in the sewer. And then there's Joan. She says God told her to fight, that she's meant to help the Dauphin reclaim his kingdom. Everyone laughs, naturally. But Joan is persistent and persuasive. By the time she's 16, she convinces a local commander to escort her through war-torn country to Chinon, where Charles is hiding in exile. Somehow, against every rule of common sense, she gets an audience. Here's the weird part. Charles doesn't just hear her out, he tests her. Allegedly, he hides in the crowd while a decoy sits on the throne. Joan walks in and walks straight past the fake prince to the real one. She tells him things only he would know. Historians still debate whether this moment really happened or if it's a later embellishment, but the result is clear. Charles believes her. So he gives her an army. That's right. A 17-year-old girl who grew up herding livestock and dodging English patrols gets handed a banner, a sword, and a few thousand skeptical soldiers. Odd fact, Joan insisted on wearing white armor. She also chopped her hair short and dressed in men's clothes, partly for modesty on the battlefield, and partly because, well, medieval armor wasn't really designed with braids in mind. This choice would later be used against her in trial. More on that soon. Her first campaign, the Siege of Orléans. The English had held the city for months. The French were desperate, disorganized, and spiraling. When Joan arrived, everything changed. She led charges. She rallied troops. She inspired ordinary soldiers with the unshakable confidence of someone who genuinely believed heaven had her back. And the siege was lifted. in just 9 days. Let me repeat that a teenager led a demoralized army into battle and within a week and a half forced the English to retreat. It was so dramatic, so inexplicable that both sides started whispering about magic. Joan didn't stop there. She pushed Charles to travel to Rennes deep in English territory so he could be officially crowned. It was dangerous. It was bold. It was exactly the kind of stunt that had kept him a claimant instead of a king. But they made it. And in July 1429, Charles was anointed as King Charles Asaph. Joan stood beside him, banner in hand. It was the climax of her mission. Now, if this were a movie, we'd roll credits here. Hero rides off into the sunset, angel singing. But real life doesn't work like that, especially not for women who succeed too quickly. Joan wanted to keep going. She wanted to drive the English out of France entirely, but Charles, newly crowned and suddenly cautious, started pulling back. He listened to his advisors. He sidelined Joan. She wasn't royalty. She wasn't male. She wasn't useful anymore, so she kept fighting without him. In May 1430, while defending the town of Compiègne, Joan was captured by the Burgundians, French allies of the English. They didn't kill her. They sold her, literally. For 10,000 livres, she was handed over to the English, who saw her as a symbol that needed breaking. They didn't want her dead, not right away. They wanted her discredited. Her trial took place in Rouen. It was a farce, a setup, a sham. She was interrogated by theologians and priests who tried to twist her words and trip her up. She had no legal counsel, no advocate, no translator. She faced charges of heresy, witchcraft, cross-dressing, and just generally being a public nuisance to the established order. They grilled her on her visions. Were they from God or the devil? They fixated on her clothes, particularly her wearing of male armor, which they called impure. One of the most debated moments came when Joan reportedly said, "If I am not in the grace of God, may God place me there. And if I am, may he keep me in it." It was a masterstroke of theology, simple, unanswerable, and humble. Still, they found her guilty. On May 30th, 1431, Joan was led to the marketplace in Rouen. She was 19 years old. Her hands were bound. Her white dress replaced with a rough shift. She asked for a cross, and a sympathetic English soldier made one from 2 sticks and tied it together with string. She was burned at the stake. Witnesses said her last word was Jesus. Her ashes were thrown into the Seine so no relics could be gathered. No shrine, no bones, no monument. But even fire couldn't erase her. 25 years later, her conviction was overturned in a retrial ordered by the Pope. She was declared innocent and a martyr. In 1920, the Catholic Church canonized her as Saint Joan of Arc. Today, statues of her stand in Paris, New York, London. There are schools, churches, and parks named after her. She's been played by actresses, sung about in rock ballads, and studied by military academies. But maybe the most extraordinary thing about Joan is that she believed absolutely unshakably in herself. In a world that saw her as disposable, she acted like she was sent from heaven. And people followed her. They rallied. They believed too, if only for a moment. Historians still debate whether Joan was truly divinely inspired mentally ill, or simply a visionary in the truest sense. What no one doubts is her impact. She changed the war. She changed the crown. She changed how the French saw themselves. And if you're still with me, gently drifting into dreams, imagine her riding through the fields of France, armor, glinting banner, fluttering horses, pounding earth into dust. She's not royalty. She's not nobility. She's not even 20. But she's in command. And somewhere far in the distance her voices whisper again. As we leave behind the thunder of hooves and smoky battlefields, we follow a quieter path through candlelit churches, echoing chapels, and the tear-soaked pages of one woman's strange and holy life. She didn't wear armor. She wept loudly and often, and she too left behind a book that's still being read. The year is 1413, and in the town of King's Lynn, Norfolk, a woman named Marjorie Kempe is about to do something most medieval women would never dream of doing. She's going to break free. Not from prison, not from a convent, but from the invisible bindings of domestic life, polite behavior, and acceptable female piety. Marjorie will cry, loudly, publicly, at Mass during sermons in the middle of pilgrimages, and she's going to write a book about it, or more precisely dictate it, because she can't read or write. It would become the first autobiography in the English language. And that's just the start. Born around 1373 into a well-off merchant family, Marjorie Kempe had a relatively comfortable life for a medieval woman. Her father, John Brunham, was a respected and influential figure in the community. Marjorie was married off young, as was expected, and went on to have not one, not two, but 14 children. Let that sink in for a second. 14. If her only legacy had been surviving childbirth that many times, she would still deserve a medal. But Marjorie's real transformation began after the birth of her first child. She suffered what we might now call postpartum depression, or perhaps a spiritual crisis. Back then, it was labeled as madness. She claimed to be tormented by demons hallucinating terrifying visions. She saw devils mocking her, clawing at her mind. Her family nearly gave up on her. At one point, she was even tied up to prevent her from harming herself. And then just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. Marjorie claimed she had a vision of Christ sitting beside her, asking gently, "Why have you forsaken me?" That moment became a pivot, a divine reset. She renounced her former life of vanity and began a new path, a path that would be anything but ordinary. Marjorie took a vow of chastity. She convinced her husband to live with her as brother and sister, a radical move, especially given how many mouths they had to feed. She started wearing white, the color of virginity and devotion, even though she was a middle-aged mother with stretch marks and spiritual baggage. It didn't matter. To Marjorie, she was reborn. What followed was a series of pilgrimages, visions, ecstatic outbursts, and relentless tears. Oh, the tears! Marjorie cried everywhere. She wailed during sermons, sobbed at the sight of statues, and collapsed, weeping when she thought about Christ's suffering. She claimed that her heart would quite literally burst with the sweetness of divine love. People didn't know what to do with her. Some were moved, others were embarrassed, many were just annoyed. Her behavior often got her into trouble. In a world that prized order and silence, especially from women, Marjorie's loud theatrical spirituality was scandalous. She talked back to priests. She claimed to speak with Jesus, Mary, and various saints as if they were just regular folks having tea in her kitchen. Odd fact, Marjorie said that Jesus once told her she was his chosen bride, and she experienced what she described as a mystical marriage to Christ. She even claimed to feel his bodily presence embracing her. Historians still debate whether this was symbolic, sensual, or something more psychologically complex, but Marjorie, for her part, was convinced it was real. She made pilgrimages to Rome, Jerusalem, Canterbury, and Santiago de Compostela, often barefoot, always weeping. She was robbed, threatened, mocked, arrested multiple times for heresy. She stood trial before bishops, including the Archbishop of York. At one hearing, she argued scripture so confidently that one of the clerics muttered, "I wish she had someone to write it all down," which eventually she did. Since Marjorie couldn't read or write, she dictated her story to a scribe. The first attempt was lost. The second took years. The result is the Book of Marjorie Kempe. A sprawling, emotional, sometimes chaotic account of her visions, travels, and inner battles. It's part mystical text, part spiritual autobiography, part medieval road trip diary. And it is weird. There are scenes where Marjorie describes having full conversations with God, who calls her daughter and comforts her during moments of doubt. There are moments of humor, like when she tries to convince a ship captain to let her board a pilgrimage boat by insisting that Jesus himself said she should go. There are also deeply human passages where Marjorie admits she still struggles with pride, still gets distracted during prayer, still yearns to be seen and understood. Historians still debate how much of her book is literal experience and how much is shaped by the conventions of medieval spiritual writing. Some scholars see it as a performance of holiness. Others read it as a subversive form of female authorship. But everyone agrees Marjorie was not ordinary. Her spiritual life was radical in another sense too, because she refused to be quiet. Most medieval women expressed faith in private through modesty and silence. Marjorie flipped that script. She made her voice impossible to ignore, and that's what makes her legacy so extraordinary. She didn't lead armies, she didn't wear a crown, but she did something arguably even more difficult. In her time, she made her interior life public. In an age where most women were barely a footnote in the records, mothers, wives, or servants with no names, Marjorie wrote herself into history, literally. She told her own story in her own words, in a language she couldn't even read. Odd detail, the original manuscript of the Book of Marjorie Kempe was lost for centuries. It was rediscovered in the 1930s, hidden in a private collection. Before that, Marjorie was mostly a rumor, a whisper in footnotes. Now, thanks to that single surviving text, she is studied alongside Chaucer and Julian of Norwich, read in classrooms and discussed in scholarly journals. Which brings us to the Julian connection. One of the most touching passages in the book is when Marjorie visits Julian of Norwich, the anchoress and visionary who wrote Revelations of Divine Love. It's a quiet moment tucked inside pages of stormy travel and emotional chaos. Marjorie sits with Julian for several days. They talk, they pray, they discuss Marjorie's visions. Julian listens, gently, kindly, and she tells Marjorie that yes, what she's experienced might well be divine. That maybe, just maybe, her noisy, inconvenient, overly emotional faith is real. And isn't that what we all want to be seen, heard, understood? As Marjorie grows older, her visions continue. Her reputation softens. People begin to see her not as a nuisance, but as someone touched by something deeper. She becomes a kind of living relic, a mystic in the flesh. She died sometime after 1438, likely in her hometown of King's Lynn. No fanfare, no canonization, no statue. Just a worn book filled with tears and joy and all the messiness of being both holy and human. So if you're still awake and the night is quiet, imagine her now, not weeping, not walking, but sitting still by candlelight. Her eyes closed, her mouth forming silent prayers. Somewhere in the distance a choir sings, and above her unseen the soft flutter of wings. Marjorie may have been strange, but she was never silent. And in that noise, those inconvenient disruptive cries of love, she carved a space where no one thought a woman belonged. Now, we turn the page to a woman who didn't weep. She wrote, furiously, elegantly, with razor-sharp clarity. And in doing so, she built a city brick by literary brick where women ruled the streets. It's early morning in medieval Paris. The air is thick with wood smoke, the chatter of market women, and the slow clatter of cartwheels on cobblestones. But somewhere beyond the noise of daily life, tucked into a quiet study, lined with parchment and ink, a woman leans over her desk. Her quill scratches furiously across the page. She isn't copying holy texts or composing letters for a man. She's writing for herself, for women, for the future. Her name is Christine de Pizan, and she is about to become the first professional female writer in the Western world. Born in 1364 in Venice, Christine's story begins with unexpected advantage. Her father, Tommaso di Benvenuto da Pisano, was a respected scholar-physician and astrologer, think medieval STEM dad, and he brought the family to Paris to serve as the royal astrologer for King Charles V of France. Unlike most girls of her time, Christine was given access to books, tutors, and ideas. Her father believed in educating her. And thank the gods, he did, because it changed everything. She grew up in the intellectual heart of the French court, surrounded by scholars and poets. At 15, she married Etienne de Castel, a royal secretary. The marriage was happy, by all accounts, a rare spark of softness in her otherwise turbulent life. They had 3 children, and then, like a well-penned tragedy, disaster struck. Her husband died of the plague when she was just 25, then her father died, and suddenly Christine was a widow, a single mother, and the primary support for her mother and niece. She had no male protector, no property, and no obvious future. Most women in her position would have remarried or entered a convent. Christine picked up a pen. She started by writing poetry elegies for her husband, ballads about grief and love, charming verses that quickly caught the attention of the nobility. Her talent was unmistakable, and patrons began to support her work. The Duke of Burgundy, the Queen of France, and even nobles in England. She wasn't just surviving, she was building a career, a woman making a living with her words. And then she got angry. See, Christine loved reading, but the more she read, the more she noticed something unsettling. Most of the male authors around her had nothing good to say about women. From church fathers to courtly poets, they described women as weak, deceitful, vain, or sinful. Take The Romance of the Rose, a wildly popular allegorical poem that basically portrayed women as manipulative temptresses. Everyone loved it. Christine did not. She wrote a scathing critique of The Romance of the Rose, arguing that it slandered half the human race. This was not a polite disagreement. It sparked a literary feud that rippled through intellectual circles. Imagine the medieval version of a Twitter flame war, but with Latin footnotes and wax seals. And it was just the beginning. Christine's most famous work came in 1405, The Book of the City of Ladies. It begins with a fictional version of herself, Christine, the character, sitting alone, depressed after reading yet another misogynistic book. She wonders if maybe women really are inferior. Then in a flash of literary brilliance, she is visited by three allegorical figures, reason, rectitude, and justice. They tell her firmly, no, women are not weak, women are not evil, you've just been reading the wrong authors. And so begins the construction of an imaginary city, a towering, glorious metropolis, built entirely by and for women. Christine lays each brick with the story of a remarkable woman, queen scholars, warriors, saints, poets. She tells of Sappho, the ancient Greek lyricist, of Queen Zenobia, of Palmyra, of Deborah, the prophetess, of female philosophers and defenders of cities. Together, they create a legacy strong enough to withstand centuries of erasure. This wasn't just a feel-good book of lady biographies, it was revolutionary. Christine didn't argue that women were superior. She argued they were equal, capable, intelligent, morally sound, and that the only reason they were thought to be otherwise was because they were denied education and autonomy. Historians still debate how radical Christine truly was. She worked within the systems of her time. She didn't demand the overthrow of patriarchy or advocate for open rebellion, but she planted seeds that would be watered by later generations of thinkers, poets, and feminists. Odd fact, Christine wasn't just a philosopher. She was a war correspondent. During the 100 Years' War, she wrote The Book of Deeds of Arms and of Chivalry, a military manual based on her interviews with soldiers and her studies of Roman tactics. Yes, that's right, she researched and published a guide to warfare, medieval multitasking. And just when you think she might slow down, she gives us one more masterpiece. In 1429, shortly before her death, Christine wrote The Tale of Joan of Arc. She was the first writer, male or female, to document Joan's story while Joan was still alive. And Christine saw in Joan not just a heroine, but a vindication of everything she had ever argued that women given the chance could fight lead and change the world. By that point, Christine had retired to a convent, still writing, still reflecting. She died sometime around 1430, but her voice never faded. Her manuscripts were copied, illustrated, and preserved in royal libraries. Her words continue to shape how later women viewed themselves and how men were forced to view them too. She never held a sword or wore a crown. She never shouted in the streets or called for a revolution, but she wielded the pen like a scalpel, cutting through lies, carving space, creating a world where women mattered. And if you're still with me, eyes heavy and breath slowing, picture her now surrounded by scrolls and quills, a candle flickering in the corner, her fingers ink-stained, her brow furrowed. Outside, Paris dozes under a velvet sky. Inside, Christine writes, not for fame, not for comfort, but because she must. She writes to remember the women no one else will, to build a city from words, to make sure that when history closes its gates, women still have a place to stand. And now we step quietly from her scriptorium into a different kind of monastery, one where visions flash like lightning and melodies rise like prayers. A place where another brilliant woman will defy the walls of her cloister and send her voice echoing through the cosmos. Picture this, the year is 1141, and in a quiet monastery nestled among the green hills of the Rhineland, a woman is seeing stars, but not in the way you or I might. Her name is Hildegard of Bingen, and what she sees are not just constellations or comets. They're divine visions, blazing wheels of fire, celestial spheres, cosmic mandalas, swirling with color and sound. She will spend her entire life trying to make sense of them. And thank goodness she does, because the result is one of the most astonishing intellectual legacies of the entire Middle Ages. But let's start at the beginning. Hildegard was born in 1098, the 10th child of a noble family. As the tradition often went for extra noble daughters, she was dedicated to the church before she turned 10. She was sent to live with an anchoress, basically a spiritual hermit named Jutta, in a stone cell attached to the monastery at Disibodenberg. Imagine being a kid locked into a life of seclusion, expected to pray fast and not ask too many questions. Hildegard asked anyway. From childhood, she experienced intense visions, flashes of light, voices, symbolic images. She didn't share them at first. In fact, she kept quiet for decades. Maybe out of fear, maybe out of modesty. But the visions didn't stop. They pressed in on her, demanding attention. By the time she reached her 40s, Hildegard finally told someone. She described a vision in which God commanded her to write everything down. And so she began her first great work, Sevias, short for Cito Vias Domini. Know the ways of the Lord. It was part theology, part prophecy, part cosmic fever dream. The writing was rich, the imagery vivid, the tone absolutely unapologetic. She sent her drafts to the most powerful theologians of the day, including Bernard of Clairvaux and even Pope Eugenius III. And they didn't burn her at the stake, they approved. And that's when everything changed. Hildegard became an international sensation, a prophetess, a counselor to emperors and popes. She began preaching not in the safe confines of her cloister, but on the road. She traveled throughout Germany on speaking tours, calling for reform in the church, condemning corruption, and reminding everyone, usually men in fancy hats, that God's word could come through a woman too. And she wasn't done. She founded not one, but 2 monasteries, the second at Rupertsberg, near the Rhine River. It was built under her direction, with her spiritual and architectural vision guiding everything. Her nuns wore flowing white robes and sang music unlike anything else in Europe. Ah yes, the music. Hildegard was a composer, and not just your average couple of chants for Vespers kind of composer. She wrote over 70 works, hymns, antiphons, sequences, all collected in her cycle, Symphonia Harmoniae Celestium Revelationum, or Symphony of the Harmony of Celestial Revelations. Her music soared, literally. It was full of dramatic leaps, winding melodies, and ecstatic ornamentation. Where Gregorian chant was grounded, Hildegard's compositions lifted you. Her lyrics, usually written in Latin, read like fevered poetry, O vis eternitatis, O ignis spiritus paracliti. Translations don't do them justice. They burn and shimmer like stained glass in sound. Odd fact, Hildegard may have invented her own language. No, seriously. She compiled a glossary of over 1,000 words in a made-up tongue called lingua ignota, unknown language. Some think it was a code for private communication between nuns. Others believe it was part of her mystical worldview, a secret vocabulary to describe things no Latin word could capture. Historians still debate the purpose, but even if it was just a spiritual side quest, it's incredibly on brand. But Hildegard wasn't all clouds and visions. She was also grounded, practical, scientific, even skeptical. She wrote 2 major medical texts, Physica and Causae et Curae, where she categorized plants, minerals, diseases, and treatments with the cool detachment of a medieval biologist. She talked about the properties of almond oil. She offered treatments for indigestion. She explored how the balance of the body affected the soul. Her model of medicine was deeply connected to nature, to the elements, to humors and balance. Modern scholars may not use her remedies, but they recognize her importance, a woman compiling systematic knowledge about the body at a time when most women weren't even allowed to learn the alphabet. And the letters, all the letters. Hildegard wrote hundreds of letters advising abbots, scolding bishops, encouraging fellow mystics. She told off Emperor Frederick Barbarossa for appointing anti-popes. She warned clergy against neglecting their flocks. She even reprimanded nuns for being too flashy. She had no patience for spiritual laziness, no tolerance for hypocrisy. One of her most dramatic episodes came near the end of her life when she allowed an excommunicated nobleman to be buried at her monastery. Local clergy demanded she dig up the body. Hildegard refused. When they placed her community under interdict, meaning no sacraments, no singing, no Eucharist, she wrote them a long, theologically dense letter defending her decision. And eventually, she won. Even in her 70s, Hildegard didn't back down. She kept writing, preaching, composing. She died in 1179 at the age of 81, a remarkable feat in itself. Legend says that at the hour of her death, 2 streams of light crossed the sky above her convent. She was remembered as a saint long before the Vatican made it official, but it wasn't until 2012, yes, the 21st century, that she was canonized and declared a doctor of the Church. Only 4 women in history hold that title. Hildegard is one of them. And if you're still awake, picture her now not in her cell, but in the chapel she built. Her hands lift toward the vaulted ceiling. Her choir of nuns begins to sing. The air vibrates with melody and incense. Her eyes, even in old age, still see patterns of fire and wings and stars. There's parchment on her desk, a page of medical notes, a song fragment, a letter to a faraway archbishop, a sketch of a wheel of cosmic light, all written in the same firm hand. And in the silence after the chant ends, the visions begin again. Hildegard's life reminds us that genius doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers in visions. Sometimes it grows herbs in a garden and listens to the wind. And sometimes it teaches the world to sing. Now from the serenity of German cloisters we shift back to the battlefield, to court intrigue, to the ink-stained contracts of marriage and conquest. Because next we meet a queen who did not see visions, but who saw opportunity and seized it. Smoke curls from the rooftops of Granada, the last Muslim stronghold in Spain, as the banners of Castile flutter in the wind. The year is 1492, and Queen Isabella of Castile stands at the gates of the Alhambra, watching centuries of warfare finally draw to a close. She's not wearing armor. Isabella doesn't fight with swords, but her conquest is complete and her legacy is about to reshape the entire world. Isabella of Castile wasn't born powerful. She wasn't even born first in line. Born in 1451 to John II of Castile and Isabella of Portugal, she spent her early years far from the center of royal power, more of a quiet pawn than a player. But the Castilian throne was a mess riddled with scandal, instability, and more illegitimate heirs than a medieval soap opera. Her half-brother Henry IV held the throne but had a wobbly grip on it. His daughter Joanna, nicknamed La Beltraneja, was widely believed not to be his child at all. The court was divided. Nobles plotted. Rumors flew. And young Isabella, quiet and observant, watched it all unfold. She wasn't the loudest voice in the room, but she was calculating. When Henry offered her a series of strategic marriages, each with big political strings attached, she stalled, negotiated, and waited for her moment. And in 1469 she made her move. She secretly married Ferdinand of Aragon, heir to the neighboring kingdom. A bold, almost reckless decision. They were second cousins, so they needed papal permission after the fact, which they forged, because of course they did. But together, Isabella and Ferdinand would become one of the most powerful royal pairs in European history. They were equals in name, if not always in practice. Ferdinand was military-minded and impulsive. Isabella was disciplined, politically shrewd, and devoutly Catholic. Together, they ruled what would become a unified Spain. Their first major act as a team taking on the nobility. Spain at the time was riddled with powerful lords who acted like little kings. Isabella and Ferdinand systematically weakened them, centralizing royal authority. They restructured the tax system, reformed the justice system, created the Santa Hermandad, kind of a national police force, with crossbows. The monarchy was no longer decorative, it had teeth. But the crown jewel of their reign was the Reconquista. The Moors had ruled parts of the Iberian Peninsula for over 700 years. Isabella and Ferdinand were determined to end it. For over a decade, they waged war against the Emirate of Granada, the last Muslim territory in Spain. It was a brutal, bloody campaign, starvation sieges, political betrayals, the usual medieval mess. And then in January of 1492, the city of Granada surrendered. The Catholic monarchs rode in triumph through the gates, and Isabella, draped in royal robes, claimed victory for Christianity. That moment, captured in frescoes and ballads, became one of the defining images of Spanish history. But the story didn't end there. Next came the Inquisition. Now, to be clear, Isabella didn't invent it. The idea of rooting out heresy had been floating around the church for centuries, but she and Ferdinand gave it new purpose and horrifying power. The Spanish Inquisition, formally established in 1478, was meant to ensure religious unity. In practice, it became a terrifying system of interrogation, forced conversions, exile, and public executions. Jews and Muslims were given a choice: convert or leave. Thousands of families were torn apart. Some fled to the Ottoman Empire. Others converted publicly, but continued to practice their faith in secret, known as conversos, or moriscos. These groups became the primary targets of the Inquisition, accused of backsliding and punished with gruesome consistency. Historians still debate Isabella's level of involvement. Was she a devout idealist determined to create a unified Christian kingdom, or a pragmatic ruler using religion to consolidate power? Probably both. Her faith was intense, sincere, and unyielding, but so was her belief in the power of order, control, and nationhood. And then, of course, there's that other little decision she made in 1492. A Genoese sailor with wild ideas and a terrible map showed up at her court. His name, Christopher Columbus. Columbus promised a faster route to Asia by sailing west. Everyone else thought he'd fall off the map or drown in the Atlantic. But Isabella, intrigued and maybe just a little bored of the domestic wars, decided to fund the journey. She pawned her own jewels, or so the legend says, and gave him 3 ships. And with that, the age of exploration exploded. Columbus didn't find Asia, he found the Caribbean, and he planted Spanish flags wherever he went. The consequences? Staggering. The Spanish Empire exploded across the Americas, bringing wealth, glory, and centuries of colonization, conquest, and devastation for indigenous peoples. Entire civilizations were destroyed. Gold and silver poured into Spain, fueling a golden age and countless wars. And it all began with Isabella's signature on a document. Odd fact, she actually wrote into Columbus's contract that he was to treat any new peoples with Christian mercy and convert them peacefully. That didn't go as planned, but it suggests that even as a powerful monarch, Isabella didn't fully grasp what she was unleashing. In her later years, Isabella remained fiercely involved in ruling. She dressed modestly, often in black, and preferred prayer to parties. She had 5 surviving children, all of whom were married into European royal houses. Her daughters became queens of Portugal, England, and the Netherlands. Her influence stretched across continents. She died in 1504 at the age of 53. Her final will and testament read like a royal instruction manual, carefully outlining succession, faith, and governance. She was buried in Granada, in the very city she had reclaimed, alongside Ferdinand. Was she a saint or a tyrant? That question still lingers. Some see her as a hero of Spanish unification, a model of female rulership in a male-dominated world. Others see her as the architect of oppression, whose pursuit of religious purity came at the cost of countless lives. Historians still debate how to measure her legacy by the strength of her rule or the damage it caused, but no one denies her impact. She was the first woman to receive the title Reina Católica, the Catholic Queen from the Pope. She ruled as a monarch in her own right, not just as a queen consort, and she proved definitively that a woman could wield power as forcefully, ruthlessly, and effectively as any man. If your eyelids are heavy, now drift with this image: Isabella sitting in her study, quill in hand, writing letters to kings, generals, cardinals. Outside, banners flap, Bells toll, ships set sail. But inside, there's only the scratch of ink, the rustle of parchment, and the quiet resolve of a woman who believes she is building an empire for God, for glory for her children. From her vision, nations rose, and from her shadow so too did centuries of consequence. But now let's leave the echoing courts of Spain and turn our gaze northward toward the hills of Italy, where another woman of power clad in armor instead of lace is building castles, backing popes, and defying emperors. The air in Tuscany is thick with pine and rosemary, the hills rolling in quiet greens and golden browns. But the calm is an illusion. In the 11th century, these hills are scattered with fortresses bristling with soldiers, and in the middle of it all is a woman known for her iron will and battle-ready brilliance, Matilda of Tuscany. She's a countess, technically. But don't let the dainty title fool you. Matilda controls more land than most kings, commands her own army, and walks the razor's edge between the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor like a woman born to rule, because in a way she was. Born around 1046 into the powerful house of Canossa, Matilda grew up surrounded by strategy, prayer, and war. Her father, Boniface III, was a duke and marquis with enough enemies to fill several jousting tournaments. Her mother, Beatrice of Lorraine, was no shrinking violet either. When Boniface was assassinated, Beatrice took over governance of the Canossa domains and raised her daughter not to be ornamental, but operational. Matilda was educated in Latin law, military affairs, and theology. While other girls learned embroidery, she learned how to read a battlefield and navigate papal politics. She was married off briefly to Godfrey the Hunchback, a moody noble with a knack for civil war, but the union didn't last long, and Matilda never remarried. Instead, she poured herself into something far more dramatic than love, the investiture controversy. Ah yes, the investiture controversy. Sounds dry, right? But don't be fooled, it was one of the most intense church versus state power struggles in medieval Europe. The issue, who gets to appoint bishops and abbots, the Pope or the Emperor Kings, of course, wanted loyal bishops in office. But the Pope wanted independence. A clash was inevitable, and in 1075 it exploded when Pope Gregory VII excommunicated Emperor Henry IV. Enter Matilda. She was a staunch supporter of the Gregorian reform, siding firmly with the Pope. She opened her castles to papal envoys, funded monasteries, and even took up arms on behalf of the Church. Her lands in northern and central Italy became a strategic buffer between the empire and the papal states. Then came the most dramatic winter in all of medieval diplomacy. In January of 1077, after his excommunication had triggered rebellion across his empire, Henry IV was forced to make the long trek across the Alps to beg forgiveness. He arrived at Canossa, yes, her castle, where Pope Gregory was staying under Matilda's protection. What followed is the stuff of legends. Henry stood barefoot in the snow outside Matilda's castle for 3 days, wearing a hair shirt and pleading for absolution. 3 days in January, in the Apennines. That's commitment or desperation or both. Eventually, the Pope relented and lifted the excommunication. But Matilda, she wasn't buying it. She remained loyal to the reformist cause, and when Henry resumed his attacks on the papacy, Matilda raised troops and fought him. Not metaphorically, literally, in armor, on horseback, commanding fortified cities and launching counterattacks. Her most famous battle came in 1080 at Volta Mantovana, where her forces crushed Henry's. For a woman to lead troops in direct military conflict was nearly unheard of. She became known not just as a noble or a pious benefactor, but as a general, a warrior. Odd fact, she was once given a sword by the Pope himself, not just as a gift, but as a symbolic recognition of her role as the Church's military defender. It was both sacred and tactical. In her hand, theology and strategy became one, but Matilda wasn't all swords and sieges. She was also an extraordinary patron of the arts. She supported monks, commissioned illuminated manuscripts, and rebuilt churches. Her court at Canossa became a cultural hub, a place where theology, music, and politics collided. And she wasn't afraid to challenge tradition in other ways. In an era when women were expected to be silent in public affairs, Matilda wrote letters that were blunt, passionate, and unapologetically authoritative. She corresponded with abbots, cardinals, and monarchs. She offered counsel to popes. She chastised enemies. Her handwriting is preserved in archives firm, fluid, confident. But despite her brilliance and power, Matilda's later years were full of tension. As the political tide shifted, she had to navigate a complex dance between factions. Emperor Henry IV was eventually replaced by his son Henry V, who needed Matilda's support. In a shocking twist, she reconciled with him and arranged for her vast territories to be inherited by the emperor upon her death. This move baffled many of her allies. Historians still debate whether it was strategic genius resignation or pressure from Rome. Even in death, Matilda's legacy was contested. When she died in 1115 at the age of 69, her body became the subject of a tug-of-war. Over a century later, in 1634, Pope Urban VIII had her remains moved to St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, making her the only woman besides royalty to be buried there. Her tomb, sculpted by Gian Lorenzo Bernini, still rests in the Vatican, a warrior in marble. But it's not just the tomb that lasts. Matilda's name became legend. She appears in Dante's Purgatorio, wandering through the earthly paradise like a saint. She became a symbol of feminine strength and righteous rebellion. A woman who built and defended the church not with incense and silence, but with garrisons and grit. And if your thoughts are softening now, your breath-slowing picture her standing on a stone battlement. Her cloak flutters in the wind. Below her, soldiers prepare for battle. Behind her, the monastery bells ring. She's not afraid. She never was. She knows what she's doing. And no emperor, no matter how loud or crowned, is going to tell her otherwise. Now, from Italy's armored hills and spiritual power plays, we slip into a quieter, but no less revolutionary world. A woman in Siena is writing letters to the Pope. She's not a queen, not a countess. Just the 24th child of a cloth dyer who would grow up to speak truth to power in the voice of a saint. The streets of Siena smell like soap wine and the damp stone of centuries. Laundry flutters on lines strung between crooked buildings. Children chase chickens through alleyways. And in a modest house nestled in a maze of narrow streets, a girl named Catherine is born the 24th of 25 children, if you can believe it. It's 1347. And the plague is about to sweep across Europe like a black tide. But for now, in this bustling household in Tuscany, one infant girl sleeps beneath a coarse linen sheet, unaware that she'll grow up to challenge popes, unite warring factions, and become one of the most influential mystics in Christian history. Her name, Catherine of Siena. From an early age, Catherine was intense. By the time she was 6, she claimed to have visions, bright immersive flashes, where she saw Christ in glory saints with wings, a golden crown hovering above her head. While other kids were squabbling over bread crusts, Catherine was pledging herself to God. Her parents were not thrilled. They had big plans for her marriage, maybe a nice alliance with a local tradesman. But Catherine refused. She chopped off her hair, not exactly the medieval makeover her mother was hoping for, smeared ashes on her clothes, and took to fasting, praying, and isolating herself in a tiny room in her parents' home. Eventually they gave in. At 16, she joined the Dominican Mantelet, a third order that allowed lay women to live at home but dedicate their lives to religious service. She wore a black and white habit, nursed the sick, and fed the poor. But Catherine wasn't interested in living a quiet life. She wasn't content to sit in the shadows. Her prayers became ecstatic. Her visions multiplied. She claimed to receive stigmata, the wounds of Christ appearing invisibly on her hands and feet. She heard voices. She talked back. And then she did something almost no woman in medieval Italy dared to do. She wrote letters, hundreds of them, to popes, kings, cardinals, soldiers, friends, enemies, strangers. They weren't sweet or shy. They were fierce, urgent, and direct. Catherine believed God had given her a message and she would not soften it for anyone. Her tone was often maternal. She called the Pope Babbo Daddy, a linguistic blend of affection and authority that must have made him sweat behind the papal tiara. She scolded corrupt clergy, begged for peace between warring city-states, and demanded church reform with a theological spine of steel. odd fact, she dictated most of her letters and books as she may have been illiterate or only semi-literate. Her scribes struggled to keep up with her rapid, breathless speech. She talked faster than the quill could move. The result? A style that's sharp, raw, and electric even in translation. By the 1370s, Catherine was one of the most recognizable voices in Catholic Europe. And just in time too, because the Church was in crisis. Since 1309, the papacy had been in Avignon, France, not Rome, a political mess. It made the Pope look like a French puppet. Italy was furious. The Church felt adrift, and Catherine of all people decided she was going to fix it. In 1376, she traveled to Avignon, not as a noblewoman, not as an envoy, but as a barefoot mystic in a threadbare robe. She secured an audience with Pope Gregory V and told him gently but firmly that he needed to return to Rome. Historians still debate how much sway she truly had, but within a year, Gregory packed up the papal court and went back to Rome. Coincidence, divine intervention, political strategy. Either way, Catherine became known as the woman who brought the Pope home. It wasn't her only triumph. Back in Italy, she continued mediating disputes, tending to the dying and gathering disciples. Her charisma was magnetic. She wasn't formally educated. She wasn't ordained. But people, powerful people, listened to her. Then came the Great Schism. After Gregory's death, a new pope was elected in Rome, and then a rival pope was elected in Avignon. 2 popes, 2 papacies, double the incense, double the problems. Europe was split. Catherine backed the Roman Pope Urban VI with unwavering loyalty. Even when he turned out to be kind of a nightmare, paranoid, erratic, and politically disastrous, Catherine stood by him. Not because she liked his personality, but because she believed Rome was where the papacy belonged. And through all this she kept writing. Her greatest literary work is The Dialogue of Divine Providence, a blend of vision, theology, and monologue that reads like a long, breathless conversation with God. It's not polite theology, it's visceral, urgent, full of metaphors and fire. God is described as a sea in which all the rivers flow and the soul is a tree rooted in desire. Her vision of love is ferocious. Her understanding of sin is raw. Her faith is not gentle, it's searing. And yet she cared deeply for others. She ministered to plague victims with her bare hands. She embraced lepers. She sat with condemned criminals before their executions, holding their heads as they died. She fasted constantly, sometimes eating nothing but the Eucharist for weeks at a time. Her health deteriorated rapidly. By 1380, she was barely eating, barely sleeping, and collapsing from exhaustion. Her body was 33 years old, same as Christ at his death, but she looked twice that. She died on April 29th of that year, surrounded by her followers, whispering prayers. In 1461, Catherine was canonized, and in 1970, nearly 600 years later, she was declared a Doctor of the Church, one of only 4 women to receive the title. Her letters are still read. Her voice is still quoted. Her statue stands in churches around the world. Oddly enough, her head is preserved in Siena. Yes, her actual head, in a reliquary. It sounds macabre, but it's meant to honor her memory. And in a strange way, it's fitting. Catherine was never afraid to face the world head-on. So, if you're drifting now, eyelids soft, breath slow, imagine her barefoot on the streets of Rome, her robe brushing against dusty cobblestones, her eyes blazing with purpose. She isn't a noblewoman, she isn't royal. But cardinals stop to listen. Soldiers lower their swords, even popes lean in. Because Catherine doesn't ask for power. She speaks and it comes. And now from mystical Siena, we drift back across the channel where the court of Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine is humming with poetry rumors and sharp-witted women. There, in the flickering glow of a candlelit chamber, sits another literary marvel, one who writes in a language few of her contemporaries had dared to call art French. The court is warm with firelight and thick with perfume. Strings of lute music drift through the corridors of an English royal hall, mingling with the hushed voices of nobles and the rustle of silk. But tucked in a quiet chamber away from the flirting and feasting, a woman sharpens her quill. She is writing not a religious treatise, not a letter to a bishop, but something more daring: poetry, fables, and love stories, all in French. Her name we don't really know. She calls herself Marie de France. That's it. No father's name, no title, just Marie from France. It's mysterious, intentionally vague, and kind of thrilling. What we do know is this: she lived during the late 12th century, probably, in the court of Henry II of England and Eleanor of Aquitaine. Her writing suggests she was highly educated, fluent in Latin, versed in classical mythology, and deeply familiar with both the aristocratic world and its literary trends. She may have been a noblewoman. She may have even known Eleanor personally. Historians still debate her identity, but her work speaks for itself, and it whispers quite beautifully across the centuries. Marie is best known for her Les 12 short narrative poems composed in Anglo-Norman French, each one exploring love, honor, betrayal, longing, and magic. These aren't fairy tales. They're romantic, yes, but also sharp-edged, ironic, and at times delightfully subversive. Take L'Inval, for example. A knight at King Arthur's court feels ignored and overlooked. One day he meets a mysterious fairy woman who offers him love and wealth as long as he keeps their relationship secret. Predictably, he doesn't, and chaos ensues. But in a rare twist, it's the woman who saves the day. She gallops in on a white horse, rescues L'Inval from trial, and rides off with him to a mystical land. The end. No tragic punishment, no damsel in distress, just a man being rescued by a powerful, enigmatic woman. In the 12th century, that's a literary mic drop. Another lie, Bisclavret, Place de la Rouergue, tells the story of a nobleman who's secretly a werewolf. He disappears into the woods for days at a time until one day his wife demands to know where he goes. When he tells her the truth, she steals his clothes, preventing him from turning human again, and runs off with another man. Years later, the werewolf-turned-wild beast is recognized for his strange gentleness and loyalty. The truth is revealed, the wife is punished, and the werewolf gets his dignity back. It's eerie, clever, and unsettling. Marie loved to blur the lines between the natural and supernatural, between cruelty and grace. Her stories aren't didactic or overly moralistic. They don't offer neat lessons wrapped in bows. Instead, they explore the emotional messiness of desire, jealousy, power, and fate. Love in her world is never simple. It lifts and wounds. It demands sacrifice. It lives outside the rules. Odd fact, Marie was one of the first writers in Europe to explicitly say she was writing for posterity. In her prologues, she declares that her tales are meant to preserve the memory of noble deeds and to entertain. She isn't content to be anonymous. She wants to be read, remembered, and recognized. That in itself was bold. And she didn't stop at the lay. She also translated over 100 Aesop's fables from Latin into French in a collection called The Fables, adding her own commentary and flair. Many of the morals she tacks on are laced with dry wit or unexpected twists. She understood power dynamics. She understood politics. She saw how noble society dressed up its greed in finery, and she didn't hesitate to poke at it. Then there's Espurgatoire, Sainte Patries, or St. Patrick's Purgatory, a dream vision narrative describing a knight's journey through a symbolic version of hell. Fire pits, demons, narrow bridges. It's practically a medieval roller coaster ride through guilt and redemption. It's been called a precursor to Dante's Divine Comedy, and it was widely circulated in the centuries after her death. Still, it's the lies that define her. They were copied, preserved, and passed on in beautifully illustrated manuscripts, some with gold leaf, others with whimsical drawings of knights and ladies locked in moonlit longing. Her language is lyrical but economical, her rhythms precise. Reading. Marie feels like being told a secret one passed from woman to woman across firelight, across time. And yet she disappeared. After the 12th century, her name faded. No records, no tomb, no cathedral bearing her likeness. For centuries, her work was misattributed or simply ignored. Only in recent decades have scholars revived her name, translated her stories into dozens of languages, and begun to recognize her as a foundational figure in Western literature. Historians still argue about her identity. Was she the abbess of a French convent the half-sister of King Henry II. A pseudonym for someone more scandalous. We don't know, and maybe that's the point. Maybe Marie wanted to vanish into her words. Maybe she knew her stories would outlive her name, or maybe, just maybe, she liked the idea of future readers wondering, what kind of woman writes about fairy lovers and werewolves, betrayal and rescue, lust and loyalty? What kind of woman tells stories where knights weep, queens scheme, and justice comes dressed in moonlight? A woman like Marie de France. And if your breathing is slow now and your eyes are fluttering at the edges, imagine her beneath a high-arched stone window, parchment rolled before her, a single candle flickering in the still air. She leans forward. Her quill dips into ink. And in the silence, she writes. So begins the tale. The fire crackles. The story continues. And in the next breath, we travel east across snow-flecked plains, where a girl queen named Jadwiga will wear a crown meant for kings, marry a pagan, and build a new future for an entire nation. Snow falls gently over the rooftops of Krakow. Horses steam in the frost. Cathedral bells toll across the grey sky as the city gathers to crown its new ruler. But this is no ordinary coronation. The clergy do not announce her as queen. They crown her as king. Her name is Jadwiga of Poland, and though she's barely a teenager, she's about to become one of the most beloved monarchs in Eastern European history. Not because she led armies, not because she wore the crown better than the boys, but because she chose love learning and legacy over personal comfort and reshaped a nation in the process. Let's back up to the 1370s. Jadwiga is born in 1373 or 1374. Medieval record-keeping wasn't exactly tick-tock accurate to King Louis the Romans of Hungary and Poland and his wife Elizabeth of Bosnia. She grows up in the glittering courts of Buda and Visegrad, surrounded by scholars, priests, and enough Hungarian nobles to make a Game of Thrones family reunion look small. From the start, she is different, bright, curious, keenly aware of the political currents around her. But she is also crucially her father's daughter, and in medieval Europe, daughters were often chess pieces on a board made of kingdoms. So Jadwiga is betrothed at age 4 to Wilhelm of Austria as part of a neat little alliance. Seems simple enough. Then her father dies in 1382. Suddenly, Poland is without a ruler. The nobles panic. They don't want her older sister Mary, already ruling Hungary, to inherit Poland too. They want someone new, someone young, someone they can work with. So they choose Jadwiga, just 10 years old. And here comes a twist. When they crown her in 1384, they give her the title King. Not queen, king. It's not a typo. It's a power move. Queen implies a consort, a helpmate, a figurehead. But king, that means sovereign authority. Odd fact, Jadwiga was likely too small to carry the ceremonial sword during her coronation, so a squire had to do it for her. Imagine a child draped in heavy robes standing beneath a golden canopy, holding the weight of an entire country. Poland wasn't playing. But then came the issue of marriage. Everyone expected her to wed Wilhelm of Austria. He even showed up, allegedly tried to sneak into her chambers to force the matter. Some accounts say he wept when she rejected him. Others say she was calm, resolute. What's certain is this: Jadwiga chose to break the engagement. She refused to marry for comfort, for personal happiness, or for tradition. Instead, she chose a political alliance that would alter the map. She agreed to marry Jogaila, the pagan Grand Duke of Lithuania. Why? Because the union promised something extraordinary: the Christianization of Lithuania, the last pagan territory in Europe, and the unification of two massive realms into one powerful commonwealth. There was opposition, of course. Jogaila was a battle-hardened duke, nearly 30 years old. He spoke no Polish. He worshipped forest gods. He didn't exactly scream dreamy husband to Jadwiga's court. But Jadwiga saw the bigger picture. Jogaila agreed to convert to Catholicism, marry Jadwiga, and become co-ruler as Władysław de Lepacharis. Jagiełło. In 1386, their marriage was sealed, and the Polish-Lithuanian alliance was born, an empire that would shape Central and Eastern Europe for centuries. Still, don't imagine Jadwiga as some passive bride bundled off to her fate. She continued to rule in her own name. She issued decrees, advised bishops, managed finances. Her husband often deferred to her judgment in Polish affairs, and while their marriage grew into one of mutual respect, she remained the political compass of the realm. But here's where she truly shines her love for knowledge. Jadwiga was a voracious learner and a tireless advocate for education. She spoke multiple languages, Latin, Hungarian, Polish, and German, and encouraged scholarly pursuits across her kingdom. One of her greatest achievements was the restoration of the University of Krakow. The university had been founded a few decades earlier but had languished without funding. Jadwiga stepped in using her personal wealth, yes, her own money, including pawning her royal jewels, to revive the school. It became the Jagiellonian University, which still exists today and ranks among the oldest universities in Europe. She wasn't doing this for prestige. She believed knowledge was a path to justice, to better governance, to a more righteous world. She didn't just fund libraries, she read in them. She also opened hospitals, supported the poor, and acted as mediator in conflicts among the nobles. Wherever there was division, she tried to sow peace with patience and policy. Her court became known for its openness, its quiet dignity, and its brilliant young scholars. But her life, like so many others in this story, was not long. In 1399, Jadwiga became pregnant. After years of selfless service, peacekeeping, and nation-building, she prepared for motherhood. She gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth Bonifacia, who died within weeks. Jadwiga followed shortly after, likely from postnatal complications. She was 25 years old. Her death devastated the kingdom. Chroniclers wrote that even the walls of Krakow wept. Her husband, usually stern and stoic, broke down in public. The people mourned her not as a monarch, but as a mother, not just of her child, but of the realm. Odd detail, before her death, Jadwiga requested her wealth and royal possessions be used for education, care of the poor, and support of the church. She left nothing for herself, only for others. In 1997, over 600 years after her death, she was canonized as a saint by Pope John Paul II. Her tomb lies in Wawel Cathedral in Krakow, where visitors still leave flowers, letters, and whispered prayers. Historians often debate her legacy not because it's in question, but because it's so vast. Was she a political genius in the guise of a child? A holy woman who led with grace instead of force? A rare queen king who proved that power and compassion weren't opposites? Probably all of the above. And if you're sinking deeper into sleep now, let yourself drift to Krakow. Picture the stained glass glowing with golden light, the soft rustle of parchment in the university's archives, a young woman in a fur-lined cloak walking slowly through the snow, her footsteps quiet, her eyes steady. She isn't playing a role. She is the role. Jadwiga reminds us that greatness doesn't always shout. Sometimes it chooses wisely. Sometimes it teaches gently. Sometimes it rules with kindness until the world changes around it. And now from snowy Poland we move to a warmer, more dangerous place, where gossip coils like incense and power wears perfume, where a pope's daughter walks a line between scandal and survival and makes sure she always lands on her feet. The torches flicker in the stone corridors of the Vatican. Perfumed robes sweep across mosaic floors. Cardinals murmur behind fans of velvet. And in the center of this theatrical whirlwind walks a woman whose name still causes scholars to wince, smirk, or sigh: Lucrezia Borgia. She is the daughter of a pope, a duchess, a political pawn, a master of survival, a woman both worshipped and weaponized, and depending on which century you ask, she is either a monster or a misunderstood marvel. Welcome to Renaissance Rome. Lucrezia was born in 1480 to Vannozza dei Catanei and Cardinal Rodrigo Borgia, who in true Vatican fashion would later become Pope Alexander VI. Yes, you read that correctly. A pope with children, not adopted ones, actual biological children. The Borgias weren't subtle about their nepotism, and Rodrigo had no interest in pretending he didn't have a favorite daughter. From a young age, Lucretia was educated with care and ambition. She spoke multiple languages, studied poetry, music, and law. Her letters are fluent, her verse elegant. She could debate scripture one moment and then charm a banquet table the next. But she wasn't raised to be a cloistered intellect. She was raised to be an asset. And that meant marriage. Lots of marriage. Her first was arranged when she was just 13, betrothed to Giovanni Sforza of Milan. It was a political alliance meant to bind the powerful Sforza clan to the new pope's interests. But alliances shifted like sand in Italy, and within 4 years the Borgias decided they didn't need the Sforzas anymore. So they dumped Giovanni. Officially, the Pope sought an annulment on the grounds that the marriage was never consummated. Giovanni, predictably humiliated, struck back with scandal. He accused Lucrezia of incest with her father and her brother Cesare. That was the spark that ignited a centuries-long blaze of gossip. The Borgia name became synonymous with poison, betrayal, and forbidden love. Historians still debate the truth. Was Lucrezia a victim of political slander, a pawn smeared by the enemies of her family, or was she complicit in the dark dealings of the Borgia machine? No one can say for sure, but here's what we do know. After her annulment, Lucrezia was spirited away to a convent for a time, whether for safety, reputation, or damage control is unclear. During this period, she gave birth to a child whose parentage remains one of the great mysteries of Renaissance gossip. The child, Giovanni, was later acknowledged in 2 contradictory papal bulls, one naming him as the son of Cesare, the other of Pope Alexander himself. Neither document named Lucrezia. It's enough to make a historian scream into a codex. But Lucrezia's story doesn't end in scandal, it evolves. Her second marriage was to Alfonso of Aragon, Duke of Bisegli, a dashing young noble related to the King of Naples. For a while it seemed hopeful. There were letters, gifts, even affection. They had a child together, a son named Rodrigo. Then Cesare got political. As the Borgias realigned themselves with France, Naples being very pro-Spanish, Alfonso suddenly became inconvenient. In 1500, he was attacked in Rome by masked men, stabbed but not killed. Lucrezia nursed him herself, staying by his bedside for weeks. Then one night someone came into his room and strangled him. Most historians blame Cesare. Some say Lucrezia must have known. Others argue she was devastated, powerless to stop it. What's clear is that the world saw her differently after that. Less as a daughter, more as a player. In 1501, she married again, this time to Alfonso d'Este, Duke of Ferrara. The Este family had been reluctant. They didn't want Borgia drama, Borgia politics, or Borgia bloodlines in their house. But Alexander VI offered a massive dowry, military support, and political favors. Eventually, they agreed. And here's the twist: Lucrezia flourished. In Ferrara, far from the claustrophobic poison cloud of Vatican politics, she became a true duchess. A patron of the arts, a mother, a ruler in all but name. Her court was filled with poets, musicians, scholars, and diplomats. She funded monasteries, libraries, and hospitals. She wrote poetry. She carried on intellectual correspondences. She hosted salons. And slowly, quietly, her reputation began to shift. Odd fact, she owned one of the first known portable printing presses in Italy. She used it to produce books, religious tracts, and poetry, not political propaganda, but literature. She wasn't just reading, she was publishing. She had 8 children with Alfonso, though not all survived. She experienced multiple miscarriages and stillbirths, including one in 1519 that would claim her life. She died at 39, worn down by childbirth and years of political tightropes. Her final years had been marked by piety, illness, and a genuine attempt at moral living. At her funeral, the people of Ferrara mourned her deeply. Not as a Borgia, not as a rumor, but as their duchess. So who was Lucrezia? Was she the poisoner, the seductress, the incestuous pawn of Borgia ambition? Or was she a survivor, a clever woman who played the only card she was given in a world run by ruthless men? Historians still argue. The gossip about her never really died. It crept into plays, operas, novels. Victor Hugo wrote about her. Donizetti turned her into a tragic heroine. Hollywood made her a femme fatale. The idea of Lucrezia Borgia became larger than her life. But if you sift through the scandal, you find something subtler. A girl born into a family with too much power. a woman who learned quickly that survival in Renaissance Italy meant sacrifice, reinvention, and silence. She didn't get to choose her marriages, but she did choose how to wield influence. She didn't control the family empire, but she did shape culture, inspire artists, and leave behind something besides smoke and rumors. And if you're still half awake, floating on the edge of sleep, imagine her not in the dark halls of Rome, but in her study in Ferrara. A book lies open on the table. A candle flickers. Outside, the court dances. But Lucretia stays inside, writing a letter in flawless Latin, her hand steady, her eyes clear. She smiles, not because she has won, but because she has survived. And now from whispers and velvet to bonfires and belief we head to a quiet French town. A woman named Marguerite Porete has written something dangerous. She's not a duchess, not a queen, just a beguine with a vision of love so pure it gets her killed. The streets of Paris are humming. Traders call out their wares, church bells echo through stone alleys. Candles flicker behind stained glass. It is the early 14th century and something radical is being whispered behind monastery doors, not gossip, not heresy, at least not yet, but a book. A strange, beautiful, and unsettling book titled The Mirror of Simple Souls, and its author is a woman named Marguerite Porete. She is not a nun, not married, not wealthy. She belongs to a semi-monastic lay movement called the Beguines. Women who lived communally, took no vows, and pursued spiritual devotion without giving up their independence. It was a kind of loophole, a way for women to escape both marriage and the cloister. And Marguerite, like many Beguines, used that freedom to think deeply, radically, uncomfortably. We know little about her life, no birth date, no detailed records, just a few surviving references and the text she left behind. But what we do know is this Marguerite dared to describe a soul's union with God that made intermediaries, priests, rituals, even morality itself seem irrelevant. That's not just bold. In medieval Europe, that's dangerous. The Mirror of Simple Souls was unlike anything of its time. It was written in French, not Latin. It took the form of a dialogue between Lady Love Reason and the soul. The prose was poetic, crystalline, and strangely modern. It spoke of divine love as something that obliterates the self. The soul, once completely surrendered to God, needs no church, no penance, no law. It simply is. Marguerite wrote of a soul so in love with God that it becomes annihilated, a word she uses again and again. Annihilated not in the sense of destroyed, but emptied, cleansed, absorbed into the divine like a drop of water into the sea. And this is where the church began to sweat. You see, when you start saying things like a soul beyond virtue no longer needs to choose between good and evil, even if you're speaking in metaphors, the Inquisition will come knocking, especially if you're a woman, especially if you're not ordained, especially if people start reading your book and nodding in agreement. Odd fact, her book was first condemned by the Bishop of Cambrai around 1306. Copies were burned. She was ordered to stop circulating it. Most would have gone quiet or at least underground. Marguerite didn't. She kept writing, kept teaching, kept sharing her ideas quietly, gently, but persistently. The book began to resurface. Copies made their way through the Low Countries, France, and even Italy. It inspired disturbed and bewildered. Historians still debate whether Marguerite truly believed obedience to the church could be bypassed entirely, or whether her metaphorical theology was simply misread by a suspicious and power-conscious hierarchy. Either way, it didn't end well. By 1308, Marguerite was arrested in Paris and imprisoned, not just questioned and released. She spent over a year in captivity facing a panel of theologians and inquisitors who tried to get her to recant. She refused. Not once, not ever. When asked to explain her writing, she said, "I do not want to answer you." When pressed further, she said, "I have said what I have said." That silence was not submission, it was defiance. In 1310, the ecclesiastical court declared her a heretic, and on June 1st she was led into the square outside the Hôtel de Ville, tied to a stake and burned alive. She did not scream, she did not plead. She became one with the flame. The crowd that watched her execution didn't cheer. Many were stunned, some were sympathetic. The Inquisition had made an example of her, but the memory refused to die. Because here's the twist, her book survived. Copies were hidden, smuggled, translated. In English, in Latin, in Middle Dutch. It appeared under false titles attributed to anonymous authors protected by mystics and reformers who saw in it a vision too luminous to extinguish. Even those who didn't fully agree with her felt the heat of her conviction. The Mirror became one of the most important mystical texts of the medieval period. It influenced later Christian mystics like Meister Eckhart Johannes Tauler and even the anonymous author of The Cloud of Unknowing. Scholars still find echoes of Marguerite's thought in Protestant reformers, radical spiritualists, and even modern contemplatives. And it all came from a woman whose name barely made it into the historical record. Marguerite's execution didn't erase her, it amplified her. Her book wasn't silenced. It sang through the centuries, whispered from monastery to monastery, recited in hidden corners, read by women who yearned to feel God not as a distant judge, but as the very breath in their lungs. Her life and death posed a terrifying question to the medieval world. What happens when a woman dares to experience the divine without permission? Odd detail. The Mirror of Simple Souls wasn't officially published under Marguerite's name until the 20th century. That's 600 years of anonymity for a woman who at the stake claimed full authorship of her beliefs. She never asked for fame. She never wielded a crown or led armies. She didn't write 1,000 letters to kings or build universities or marry powerful men. She just wrote, quietly, beautifully, uncompromisingly. And if you're drifting off now, caught between sleep and waking, imagine her not in flames, but in a quiet garden. A book open in her lap. Birds flitting through the hedges. The wind murmuring through the leaves like a prayer in a language no one has spoken for centuries. She reads the sky, not the law. She sings to the silence. She writes because she must. Marguerite reminds us that power doesn't always arrive in armor or ink-stamped edicts. Sometimes it looks like a woman with a vision too bright to burn away. And with her final breath, our journey through the lives of the most influential women in medieval history comes gently to rest. And now we let the fire burn low. Across castles and cloisters, battlefields and manuscripts, we've walked with women who defied expectation, who stood in crowns and bare feet, armor and veils, speaking in royal courts, in abbey chapels, and in whispered visions. Some led armies. Some wrote words so sharp they cut centuries. Some ruled with steel. Others ruled with silence. What unites them isn't where they came from, but how fiercely they lived. How clearly they saw themselves in a world that refused to see them. Eleanor endured prison and raised kings. Hildegard turned visions into music. Christine built cities from language. Joan rode into battle with nothing but a banner and her belief. Jadwiga taught a kingdom how to lead without cruelty. And Marguerite. She proved that a woman's soul could burn brighter than the fire that tried to consume her. Each life we've explored is a thread in a tapestry, one that stretches beyond history, beyond gender, into something softer, stronger, and infinite. So now let go of dates and titles. Let the queens and mystics and poets fade gently into your dreams. Let them walk beside you, not as relics of a past long buried, but as quiet, steady echoes reminding you that courage comes in many forms, even now. Especially now. Good night. And sweet dreams of powerful women waiting patiently in the shadows of time for you to remember them once more.